They brought the captured Sd.Kfz 222 into the clearing with the quiet efficiency of men who had dragged too many wrecks off too many roads. Dust drifted from its angular plates, settling in pale sheets across the turret frame. For a moment, the vehicle looked almost dignified in the late afternoon light, an icon of German reconnaissance power, delivered into Allied hands by chance rather than design. Yet even before the engine cooled, something about its battered posture suggested that its secrets were close to the surface. Near the rear hull, a single, almost delicate bullet hole traced a perfect circle through the armor. It was not the kind of damage the Germans would have wanted their enemies to study. The men gathered around it silently, feeling the odd discomfort that comes when a myth acquires its first visible crack. They knew the 222 by reputation, fast, agile, formidable at a distance. But reputation, like armor, sometimes concealed more than it protected. One by one, the mechanics climbed inside. They moved without speaking, their knuckles brushing the interior walls, expecting the reassuring solidity of hardened steel. Instead, the panels resonated faintly under their touch, thin, almost hollow, as if built less for survival than for appearance. In the cramped half-light of the fighting compartment, the realization settled slowly. This was not a fortress on wheels, it was a shell. Outside, a rifleman raised his weapon for a test shot, half amused by the idea that such a famous machine might flinch under a single round. The crack of his rifle rolled across the clearing and vanished into the trees. The 222 did not collapse, did not split open, but the men heard something subtle, an almost metallic shiver, the sound of material strained beyond its promise. They gathered around the strike point, studying the shallow inward deformation where the round had kissed the armor. The dent was small, almost trivial, but it carried implications none of them were eager to voice. If this was the result of a single rifle shot, what would sustained fire do? What would a machine gun do? The questions hung between them like fog. Then someone whispered the words that none had wanted to say aloud. "This thing isn't even bulletproof." The comment settled over the group like a verdict, quiet and final. And in that stillness, the myth of the Sd.Kfz 222 began to dissolve, because in the forests beyond their clearing, other crews were relying on armor just like it, unaware that its limits had already been exposed. The second shot came without humor. Fired from closer range, its report cut sharply through the clearing, followed by the unmistakable thud of metal giving way. When the dust cleared, the new impact lay deeper than the first, no longer a surface blemish but a wound that spoke plainly. The men approached slowly, aware that each step brought them closer to an answer they were no longer certain they wanted to find. They gathered around the fresh mark, fingertips brushing the torn edges as though confirming the texture of disbelief. The steel felt thin, improperly ambitious for a vehicle meant to scout battlefields shaped by mortars and machine guns. What should have been hardened armor felt instead like an improvised compromise, a reminder that even in war, not all machines were built equal. They were not handling the confident artifact of a modern army. They were examining the frailties beneath its painted surface. A mechanic called out the measurement, 8 millimeters, sloped but insubstantial. The number drifted across the group with a quiet finality. They recognized what it meant. At that thickness, even standard rifle fire could threaten the crew. And yet German reconnaissance troops had trusted this plating as they raced through contested ground, believing the angles and speed would protect them. It was a trust that now felt painfully misplaced. For a moment, no one spoke. The machine sat before them like an unmasked actor, its performance credible from afar, exposed up close. Then a sergeant broke the silence and ordered the engine started. Armor was only part of the truth. They needed to understand the rest. If survivability had been sacrificed, perhaps mobility had been its justification. The engine turned over with a dry, metallic protest, then settled into a steady rumble. As the 222 lurched forward, its suspension shuddered in response, the entire frame quivering with the eagerness of a machine engineered for speed rather than protection. It moved lightly across the ground, almost graceful in its acceleration, but even that grace hinted at the cost. Weight had been trimmed not for efficiency, but for necessity. Watching it circle the clearing, the men reached the only conclusion the evidence allowed. This vehicle had been designed to outrun danger, not withstand it. Its armor was a gesture, not a shield, thin enough to betray, strong enough only to delay. And as the engine idled into silence, a single, unmistakable truth settled over them. Mobility had been its promise because armor could never be its defense. Somewhere deeper in German territory, crews were still depending on that promise, unaware of how quickly it could fail. The cataloging began with routine precision. One group measured the armor seams, another traced the engine layout, while a third examined the turret ring and its compact mount for the Fu-G radio set. These were the fundamentals by which any vehicle's purpose could be read, the structural grammar that revealed what its designers valued and what they were willing to risk. Yet with each detail recorded, the portrait that emerged was not of a hardened scout car, but of a machine built on carefully stacked assumptions. Every new measurement reaffirmed the same pattern. The Sd.Kfz 222 offered extraordinary visibility through its open-topped turret and latticed anti-grenade screen. Its agility was undeniable, powered by a lightweight chassis meant to carry reconnaissance teams across vast terrain at speeds that heavier armor could never match. But the protection enveloping all this capability was startlingly thin, as though survivability had been traded away in the hope that speed alone would create safety. The men paused over their notes, recognizing a truth the battlefield had a habit of revealing too late. Quietly, they speculated how many German crews had discovered these limits under fire. Reconnaissance demanded proximity, closing distance, observing, reporting, yet this vehicle seemed built for a version of war where the enemy responded slowly, or not at all. It was a machine that performed beautifully until the first rounds came in. After that, its advantages dissolved into vulnerability. They inspected the 20 autocannon next, its barrel still carrying the faint residue of past engagements. On paper, it was formidable, high rate of fire, effective against light armor, useful even for anti-air bursts. But the weapon's promise dimmed when they considered the man who operated it, seated behind plating no thicker than a household boiler. Firepower meant little if the crew stood exposed to nearly every weapon on the field. The contradiction was stark and not easily dismissed. As their observations grew into formal sentences, the tone of their report shifted. What had arrived as a feared enemy vehicle now felt closer to a warning, a reminder that a machine could project strength while concealing fragility. This would shape how frontline troops understood the 222, not as a predator, but as a fast-moving silhouette whose threat depended on distance and surprise. Yet one question remained. Why had Germany fielded such a vehicle in the first place? To answer that, the men knew they would have to look beyond the machine itself and into the doctrine that had imagined it, because doctrine, more than steel, determined what lived and what was lost. The Sd.Kfz 222 did not appear suddenly on the battlefield. It emerged from a decade of theory, testing, and belief. In the 1930s, as Europe drifted toward uncertainty, German military planners revisited an old conviction that wars were not won by brute force alone, but by the foresight gained before the first major engagement. Reconnaissance, swift, informed, relentless, was the invisible thread that could pull opponents off balance long before armies truly collided. From this conviction, the 222 began to take shape, not merely as a vehicle, but as a philosophy rendered in steel. Within the evolving doctrine of the Wehrmacht, mobility became a kind of armor in its own right. Commanders argued that speed could do what plating could not: keep their crews alive by removing them from predictable lines of fire. If a scout car could move faster than the enemy could react, then its vulnerability mattered less than its ability to see first, report first, and disappear before danger arrived. In this worldview, surprise became synonymous with survival, a currency more valuable than millimeters of steel. Designers translated this doctrine directly into the 222's frame. Its compact hull minimized weight. Its powerful 3.8-liter Horch engine allowed it to accelerate with almost startling urgency. Its four-wheel drive offered maneuverability through mud, sand, and broken ground. Each technical choice reflected an assumption: speed would outmatch fire. And because its mission was to observe rather than to fight, the armor remained thin, a calculated risk shaped by expectations of how the vehicle would be used. Even the open-top turret was intentional, granting unmatched visibility despite exposing the crew to the elements and stray shrapnel. The decision to rely on 8 armor sloped for marginal improvement was accepted without controversy. German doctrine insisted that the 222 would not linger near hostile guns. It would skirt the battlefield's edges, collecting intelligence, probing weak spots, and reporting back before artillery or anti-tank units could respond. In such role, heavier armor was not only unnecessary but counterproductive. It would slow the vehicle and dilute the very principle it was built upon. When the war began, early victories appeared to vindicate this reasoning. Across Poland, France, and the Low Countries, maneuver warfare unfolded with alarming speed. Panzer columns sliced through enemy lines while reconnaissance units, many equipped with the 222, raced ahead to identify river crossings, ambush points, and vulnerable supply routes. Communications flowed rapidly, command decisions accelerated, and the carefully choreographed system of blitzkrieg found its rhythm. To commanders who witnessed these successes firsthand, the 222 seemed perfectly aligned with Germany's new way of war. Praise came easily in those months. Officers spoke of the 222 as the ideal companion to armored spearheads, a vehicle that extended their sight while imposing almost no logistical burden. Its weaknesses were known but rarely felt. Its strengths were visible in every kilometer gained before resistance could solidify. It was a machine that embodied the optimism of rapid conquest. But doctrines, like machines, reveal their limits only when the environment changes. As the front lines stretched beyond the bounds of early expectations and enemies adapted to the tempo of German operations, the faith in speed over protection would soon encounter terrain and firepower it had never been designed to withstand. And the Sd.Kfz 222, once a symbol of momentum, would become a case study in what happens when assumptions meet reality. German reconnaissance units were never meant to stand toe-to-toe with the enemy. They were trained as the forward senses of the army, moving ahead of the main columns to map roads, locate river crossings, identify ambush sites, and expose weaknesses before larger forces committed themselves. In doctrine, their value was measured not in shots fired, but in information returned, details that shaped decisions hours or even days before opposing sides exchanged serious fire. Reconnaissance was a craft of precision and restraint, and the vehicles assigned to it were chosen accordingly. From the start, German planners assumed their reconnaissance troops would face opponents who were unprepared, disorganized, or overwhelmed by the tempo of blitzkrieg. Light armor, by that logic, was not a vulnerability but an acceptable compromise. It reduced weight, increased speed, and allowed these units to cover ground faster than infantry or tanks could respond. The war Germany expected was one where mobility dictated survival, and where contact with hostile forces was brief, controlled, and above all, avoidable. The open-top turret of the Sd.Kfz 222 perfectly reflected this belief. It granted the commander and gunner an unparalleled field of view, allowing them to scan hedgerows, rooftops, and distant tree lines with minimal obstruction. In reconnaissance work, such visibility was priceless, yet the cost of that advantage was stark. Exposure to shrapnel, grenades, and small arms fire turned the turret into a paradox, an instrument of awareness that also made its crew more vulnerable than the doctrine admitted. What served vision undermined survival. Even the armament revealed the assumptions behind the design. The 20 kW K-30 autocannon, fed by 20-round magazines, was formidable against light vehicles and could suppress infantry at range. But it was never intended to trade fire at close quarters with entrenched riflemen. Its role was deterrence rather than dominance, a tool to discourage pursuit rather than win battles. In practice, this meant the 222's gun invited either respect or indifference depending on the circumstances, and the front lines rarely offered predictable circumstances. German reconnaissance doctrine rested on an illusion both elegant and fragile, that enemies would react slowly to rapid advances. During the early campaigns, this seemed reliable. Armies caught off guard by blitzkrieg struggled to coordinate countermeasures. Road networks clogged, communication systems faltered, and units attempting to reposition often collided with one another instead of the enemy. In such conditions, the 222 thrived. It darted across terrain that opponents had not yet secured, gathering intelligence that sharpened the cutting edge of German maneuver warfare. But illusions weaken the moment they are understood. By 1941, as the war expanded into harsher climates and more resilient opponents, the methods Germany relied upon began to lose their novelty. Adversaries learned the rhythm of German advances. They constructed layered defenses, improved communication, and most importantly, anticipated the arrival of reconnaissance vehicles. The battlefield grew less forgiving, and mistakes carried heavier consequences. Into this changing landscape rolled the Sd.Kfz 222, still shaped by assumptions forged in a different phase of the war. Its speed remained impressive, its visibility unmatched, but neither could compensate for opponents who now responded quickly and with increasing precision. Ahead of it lay terrain where doctrine no longer dictated the terms, and where the cost of misjudgment would be paid in steel and in lives. In the early campaigns of Poland and France, German assumptions held firm. Many defenders were poorly armed or strategically overwhelmed, and reconnaissance units encountered opposition that dissolved before it could properly respond. The Sd.Kfz 222 seemed to justify its design. It moved swiftly through disorganized resistance, slipping past roadblocks and outmaneuvering scattered infantry who lacked the coordination to exploit its vulnerabilities. For a time, the vehicle appeared perfectly aligned with the war Germany believed it would fight. That illusion ended on the Eastern Front. In the vast and unforgiving landscapes of 1941, Soviet riflemen studied the 222 not with awe, but with clarity. They recognized it not as a small tank, an error made by earlier opponents, but as a lightly skinned car whose threat depended entirely on distance. The moment that distance collapsed, its weaknesses became obvious. Soviet troops engaged it at close range, focusing their fire on its thin side plates and exposed turret, turning ordinary weapons into instruments of decisive effect. The battlefield had changed, and the 222's reputation changed with it. At ranges under 100 meters, the physics became impossible to ignore. Standard 7.6 Tomb rifles, armor-piercing rounds, and heavy machine guns could punch through the 8 hull with alarming consistency. What had once been a theoretical vulnerability now manifested itself in abrupt losses. Vehicles struck not by anti-tank guns, but by weapons long considered incapable of harming armored reconnaissance units. Crews accustomed to operating with confidence felt that confidence evaporate in the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing across open fields. Reports flowed back from the front, written in the measured tone of professionals describing events that defied expectation. Reconnaissance teams recounted vehicles destroyed in ambushes where only infantry were present, or disabled by shots that should have ricocheted harmlessly. To many in the rear, these statements sounded improbable, even mistaken. German command initially dismissed them as misidentification. Surely the damage had come from concealed anti-tank rifles, hidden artillery, or heavier Soviet weapons misread in the chaos of combat. But war has a way of turning disbelief into record. Soon, inspectors examined wrecks brought from the field, hulls perforated by rifle rounds, turret armor curled inward by machine gun. Fire engine blocks exposed through fractures that followed no expected pattern. The evidence was blunt and undeniable. The Sd.Kfz 222's armor, sufficient for the early blitzkrieg, had become inadequate in a theater that reacted faster and struck harder than Germany's doctrine had allowed for. Thin armor was meeting thick resistance. From that point onward, the 222 operated in a world that no longer accommodated its original purpose. The vast front offered few places to hide, and Soviet infantry, now familiar with its limitations, no longer hesitated to engage it directly. Mobility still mattered, but it could not erase the vulnerability etched into its steel. And as reconnaissance crews adapted to this harsher reality, they found themselves confronting a deeper question: whether the vehicle that once led the advance could survive the war it had helped to create. Over time, reconnaissance troops came to understand, with a clarity no manual could soften, the true odds they faced inside the Sd.Kfz 222. Training emphasized confidence, mobility, and precision, but experience introduced something more sobering. Crews learned that survival depended not merely on executing doctrine, but on rewriting it in the field. Vulnerability sharpened their instincts. Every patrol became an exercise in reading the landscape as much as reading the enemy. They knew their machine could move quickly, but they also knew how quickly it could fail. To compensate, crews began to drive lower than regulation demanded, crouched behind the vehicle's thin plates as though posture alone could thicken the armor. They used terrain aggressively, slipping along drainage ditches, tree lines, and the folds of open ground. Open roads, once intended as the reconnaissance unit's natural domain, became places to avoid unless necessity left no alternative. The men learned to treat movement itself as a form of camouflage, keeping the 222 in constant, unpredictable motion, denying enemy riflemen the steady target they now understood it to be. Improvisation followed. Crews added sandbags where they could, despite the fact that command frowned upon the practice. Some collected spare track links from passing panzer units, hanging them over the side plates like makeshift shields. Others scavenged steel from disabled vehicles or abandoned structures, welding on whatever scraps seemed capable of slowing a bullet's path. But these additions carried their own penalty. Every kilogram of extra weight dulled the 222's one true advantage, its speed. The men felt the drag in every acceleration, every turn, every climb, and knew each improvised solution came with its own compromise. The turret received particular attention. Crews feared its openness, the way the anti-grenade screen provided only reassurance, not real protection. Some units welded extra plating around the turret ring, shaping a crude collar intended to deflect small arms fire. They worked late into the night with borrowed tools, the sparks from their torches briefly illuminating the thin boundary between precaution and hope. Few believed these additions would save them from direct hits, but in a war where the line between survival and loss was measured in millimeters, even symbolic armor was better than none. Experience eventually trained the men more effectively than doctrine ever had. Crews began dismounting more frequently, scouting on foot through forests, ruined villages, and open fields. It was slower and riskier, but safer than exposing the car to sudden fire. The 222 remained nearby, its engine idling softly, ready to relocate or extract the dismounted team. This adaptation shifted the vehicle's role from a forward observer to a silent companion, less the eyes of the army and more its concealed messenger. Letters home reflected the quiet resignation that grew among these troops. They wrote of the 222 with a mixture of fondness and unease, describing it as fast but fragile, a machine that rewarded skill but punished misjudgment. Others called it nimble but thin-skinned, the kind of vehicle one trusted only when the terrain allowed it. One soldier wrote that each patrol felt like a gamble every time. A sentiment echoed across units stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. These men cared for their vehicles diligently, but they understood that diligence could not overcome physics. Within the ranks, the Sd.Kfz 222 became a paradox. Crews respected its agility, the way it responded instantly to throttle and steering, the way it could weave through obstacles that halted heavier machines. But that same respect was shadowed by fear. They knew the armor would not forgive mistakes, and that a single burst of well-aimed fire could turn the reconnaissance mission into a recovery operation. The vehicle that once symbolized initiative and momentum now embodied the tension between speed and survival, doctrine and reality, intent and consequence. Yet the crews adapted because they had no choice. They shaped their tactics around the machine's gifts and its frailties, conducting their missions with a humility absent from the doctrines that had produced it. And in the widening conflict ahead, this uneasy balance between agility and vulnerability would face forces more unforgiving still, forces that would expose not only the limits of the machine, but the limits of the assumptions behind it. German engineers approached the Sd.Kfz 222 with the same analytical discipline they brought to every vehicle in the reconnaissance fleet. They studied field reports, inspected damaged hulls, and listened to the quiet warnings coming from the Eastern Front. Each revelation pointed toward the same conclusion: the 222 needed more protection. Yet when the engineers returned to their drafting tables, they confronted a limitation far more stubborn than doctrine or wishful thinking. The chassis itself, compact, lightweight, and finely balanced, could only bear so much additional steel before its advantages collapsed. Every proposal to increase armor encountered the same mechanical barrier. Adding more plate, even by millimeters, pushed the vehicle toward a weight it was never meant to carry. The Horch engine, reliable but modest in output, began to strain under the extra burden. Acceleration dulled, turning radius widened. Off-road agility, one of the 222's essential strengths, declined with each kilogram added. What protected the crew in theory threatened them in practice. Engineers found themselves circling a paradox. Reinforce the vehicle, and it no longer performed the task for which it had been created. The turret offered no easy solutions either. Its open-top design had been chosen to maximize visibility, a cornerstone of reconnaissance. Attempting to enclose it or add significant plating compromised that very purpose. Spatial constraints tightened the dilemma further. The turret ring was small, the fighting compartment narrow, and any attempt to redesign the layout risked reducing the crew's ability to operate the gun effectively. The engineers confronted a fact that wartime demands often reveal. Good visibility and strong protection rarely coexist within the confines of light armor. A revised version of the 20mm gun, the Kw-K38, promised higher rate of fire and more reliable performance against soft targets. It was a meaningful improvement, particularly for units facing unarmored vehicles or exposed infantry. Yet even as crews welcomed the enhancement, everyone understood its limitation. Firepower could deter, but it could not shield. The gun might force an enemy rifleman to hesitate, but it offered no defense if that rifleman fired first. Survivability was not a matter of weapons, but of material, thickness, and the seconds in which a bullet found its mark. Reconnaissance doctrine entered its own cycle of frustration. Officers debated how to preserve the 222's mobility while acknowledging the battlefield's changing conditions. They stressed caution, emphasized terrain use, and refined communication drills. But none of these adjustments altered the central problem. Speed could no longer guarantee safety. With every passing month, the Eastern Front produced engagements where mobility mattered less than resilience. The vehicle that once slipped between threats now struggled to remain ahead of them. Gradually, the engineers accepted an unsettling truth. The 222 was not failing because it was poorly designed. It was failing because it had been designed for a different war. Its limits were structural, inherent in the very geometry of its chassis and armor. They could revise the gun, rework ventilation, reinforce the turret, or improve suspension components, but the foundation remained unchanged. The platform had reached the ceiling of its potential, and any further effort to push beyond it would create a machine neither fast nor protected, an unsatisfactory hybrid that satisfied no requirement fully. Meanwhile, the war moved with increasing intensity, evolving faster than the vehicles meant to serve it. Enemies adapted, terrain expanded, firepower grew more concentrated and more precise. The assumptions behind the 222 gradually lost their grounding, overtaken by a conflict that no longer resembled the swift campaigns of 1939 and 1940. The pace that once favored German reconnaissance now imposed demands the 222 could not meet. And as engineers confronted the inevitability of these limits, a new question emerged. What would replace the vehicle that had embodied the early doctrines of maneuver and speed? The answer, waiting just beyond the horizon, would reshape how Germany scouted the front. Allied forces encountered the Sd.Kfz 222 long before they understood it, but once they did, the learning curve was swift. Patrols returning from early clashes began noting patterns in field journals and intelligence debriefs. The vehicle looked sharp, moved quickly, and carried a gun that demanded respect. But beneath that first impression lay vulnerabilities too clear to ignore. As each report accumulated, a portrait emerged, not of an invincible scout car, but of a machine whose survivability depended entirely on being neither seen nor hit. Infantry units were the first to grasp that the 222's protection was thinner than its silhouette implied. Soldiers learned that standard small arms, often dismissed as irrelevant against armor, could be decisive when distance evaporated. Intelligence briefings began listing rifles and armor-piercing ammunition as effective at close range, particularly against the side plates and turret housing. This realization altered frontline behavior. What had once been regarded as a lightly armored threat became, in the right circumstances, a fragile target. At greater distances, heavier weapons turned the reconnaissance car's weaknesses into liabilities. Anti-tank rifles, still present in several Allied armies despite their declining effectiveness against modern armor, punched through the 222's hull at ranges extending beyond 200 meters. Heavy machine guns, firing concentrated bursts, tore through the vehicle's thin panels with alarming ease. Crews who once believed in the safety of speed now found that distance no longer guaranteed survival. The 222 had entered a battlefield where nearly every weapon held the potential to defeat it. Ambush tactics evolved quickly. Allied troops learned to exploit the 222's distinctive silhouette, the sloped hull, open-top turret, and angular fenders that made it easy to identify even at a glance. Infantry laid traps in villages, forests, and roadside depressions, striking at the moments when the vehicle slowed or committed to a narrow path. They aimed for moments of predictable movement, bridge crossings, choke points, reconnaissance halts. Terrain became a weapon, and surprise became the equalizer. Against such tactics, the 222's armor offered little defense. Captured examples accelerated this adaptation. Engineers and intelligence officers examined seized vehicles with methodical patience, measuring each angle, studying the turret assembly, and mapping ammunition storage. They documented the thinness of the plates, the exposed turret ring, the vulnerable radiator placement, and the limited traverse of the main gun. Each detail was fed back to frontline units, turning technical data into battlefield knowledge. Intelligence summaries noted that while the vehicle was agile, its protection remained fundamentally inadequate for sustained contact. Even so, Allied reports rarely dismissed the 222 outright. Many expressed a reluctant admiration for its mobility, the way it handled rough terrain, the responsiveness of its steering, the speed with which it could reverse or reposition. They saw its value as a reconnaissance platform and understood why German doctrine had relied on it. But that respect carried an undertone of unease. Analysts recorded concern for the crews who operated such a lightly armored machine, men required to approach danger with little more than speed standing between them and a rifle round. Thus the 222 entered Allied intelligence files as a paradox, dangerous when unseen, doomed when detected. It could punish isolated infantry, scout ahead of armored formations, or slip through gaps that heavier vehicles could not. Yet the moment its presence was known, its advantages evaporated. Visibility became vulnerability. Firepower became irrelevant. And the battlefield, ever adapting, reshaped itself around the knowledge that speed alone could not shield a crew forever. But the Allies' growing understanding pointed toward a larger shift unfolding across the war. The days when reconnaissance vehicles could rely on assumption, surprise, or doctrine were ending. Ahead lay a conflict defined not by what armies believed about their machines, but by how quickly those beliefs could be overturned. By 1943, the character of the war had changed beyond recognition. The firepower carried by enemy infantry increased dramatically, not only in quality but in sheer quantity. New rifles with higher muzzle velocity, belt-fed machine guns with greater penetration, and a battlefield crowded with overlapping firing positions created an environment the Sd.Kfz 222 had never been designed to endure. What had once been a contest of maneuver now became a contest of survival, fought in landscapes where even a moment's exposure invited catastrophic loss. The wide, open lanes that had enabled the early successes of Blitzkrieg no longer existed. The once clean avenues through which reconnaissance vehicles glided ahead of armored thrusts had become lethal corridors. Defenders now occupied them with stubborn determination, supported by coordinated fields of fire. Roads that once promised speed were now bordered by entrenched rifle squads, camouflaged gun pits, and weapons waiting patiently for the first glint of a passing vehicle. The environment itself had shifted from permissive to predatory. Reconnaissance NCE vehicles that had slipped through gaps in 1939 and 1940 now found those gaps filled with minefields, anti-tank traps, and local countermeasures improvised by increasingly experienced troops. Villages that once surrendered at the sight of German armor were now fortified strongpoints. Even abandoned houses and tree lines carried hidden dangers. The 222's agility still allowed it to maneuver around some threats, but no amount of skill could compensate for a battlefield that had simply grown too dense with danger. Light armor, once a calculated compromise, now revealed its cost with brutal clarity. When concentrated fire met thin plating, the result was immediate and unforgiving. Reports described vehicles struck by machine gun volleys that penetrated through both hull sides, or disabled by rifle fire that shattered critical components behind the armor. Flames consumed the reconnaissance cars with alarming speed. Their interiors, compact and unprotected, left crews little time to escape. Survivors spoke of engagements decided in seconds, where the difference between spotting an enemy position and being spotted first meant the difference between life and loss. As casualties rose, German command was forced to confront a problem that doctrine could no longer obscure. Mobility had been the guiding principle behind the 222, but mobility alone no longer ensured survivability. Attempts to reinforce the vehicle had reached their structural limits, and the battlefield now demanded reconnaissance machines that could withstand direct fire, not merely avoid it. The balance between agility and protection had shifted, pulling the 222 out of the role for which it had been conceived. Gradually, the Sd.Kfz 222 was reassigned to safer duties. It began operating behind the forward edge of battle, performing route security, courier missions, and perimeter reconnaissance rather than leading armored formations into the unknown. Some units employed it for policing occupied territories or protecting supply convoys, roles where its speed remained useful, and its vulnerability less immediately fatal. The vehicle could still contribute to the war effort, but on terms more limited than the expansive ambitions of its early years. For crews who had once ridden at the spearhead of German advances, the change felt symbolic. The 222 had been in the early war a herald of German momentum, a machine that saw the battlefield before anyone else, shaping decisions at the highest command levels. Now it survived only at the margins, present but diminished, a reminder of doctrines overtaken by time and conditions. Where it had once led, it now followed. Where it had once defined the reconnaissance war, it now served as a reluctant witness to its transformation. Yet its withdrawal from the front line was not a failure of engineering, but an evolution of circumstance. The war had grown heavier, the threats more concentrated, the pace dictated no longer by what Germany expected but by what reality imposed. And in that shifting landscape, the Sd.Kfz 222 stood as a testament to the limits of a design built for speed in a world that increasingly demanded resilience. Ahead, the German army would seek machines capable of surviving where the 222 could not. Vehicles born from the hard lessons of a battlefield that rewarded protection as fiercely as it once rewarded mobility. By the middle years of the war, the discrepancy between doctrine and reality had grown too large to ignore. Major engagements across the Eastern Front, North Africa, and later Italy revealed what field reports had been hinting at for months. Mobility alone could no longer guarantee survival. The speed that once protected German reconnaissance crews had lost its privileged place on the battlefield. Rifle fire now traveled farther, machine guns concentrated more densely, and defenders reacted with a precision that caught fast-moving vehicles long before they slipped out of sight. The theoretical shield of maneuver had fractured. Frontline reconnaissance units were the first to feel the weight of this change. They reported, with increasing urgency, episodes in which the Sd.Kfz 222 found itself pinned by small arms fire that earlier crews might have dismissed as background noise. What had once been sporadic harassment became sustained suppression. Roads that had offered clean lines of escape now became traps where a single burst from a concealed machine gun froze the vehicle in place. For the first time since its introduction, the 222's mobility proved insufficient even to disengage safely. The consequences were immediate and deeply unsettling for those inside the turret. Crews accustomed to using their speed as a shield now found themselves abandoning their vehicles in mid-mission, forced into the open by rifle fire penetrating the thin armor. It was a humiliating act for men trained to depend on their machines, but it was also a rational one. The open-top turret and thin plating provided little protection once the enemy closed the distance. Accounts from the period describe crews leaping from their scout cars under fire, scrambling toward depressions in the earth or the cover of nearby structures, an image that stood in sharp contrast to the confidence of earlier years. As these incidents multiplied, German command could no longer attribute the losses to chance or misidentification. The reality was unavoidable. The Sd.Kfz 222 had become too lightly armored for the mid-war battlefield. What had been a strength during fast-moving campaigns had turned into a liability as defenses deepened and firepower intensified. The doctrine that had once celebrated speed as armor now confronted a harsh and simple truth. Speed could help a vehicle avoid danger, but it could not nullify it. The response from high command was measured but significant. Heavier reconnaissance platforms entered service, armored half-tracks such as the Sd.Kfz 250 series, and even light tanks modified for scouting roles. These vehicles carried more armor, offered enclosed protection for their crews, and could withstand the rifle calibers that now dominated the battlefield. Their presence provided reconnaissance units with a resilience the 222 could no longer deliver, allowing them to remain in contested zones long enough to gather meaningful information. Transitioning to these new systems, however, was anything but seamless. Germany's production lines were strained by the demands of a widening war, and fuel shortages limited the operational range of heavier vehicles. Mixed formations became common, 222s operating alongside half-tracks, armored cars pairing with improvised scout units, newer machines filling gaps rather than replacing older ones outright. The evolution unfolded unevenly across the front, with some units receiving modern replacements while others continued operating 222s because no alternatives were available. The doctrine that had guided reconnaissance since the 1930s, built on assumptions forged in exercises, early campaigns, and an era of limited resistance, now revealed its age. The war had outgrown those assumptions. The speed that once granted confidence had become an inadequate answer to fields layered with automatic fire. Visibility, once the 222's defining advantage, increasingly meant exposure. And armor, once treated as a secondary concern, had become the difference between returning with information and not returning at all. In the end, the breaking of the doctrine was not a single moment, but a gradual accumulation of experiences. Stalled retreats under rifle fire, abandoned vehicles smoldering in roadside ditches, and crews whose survival owed more to instinct than to design. The pre-war vision of reconnaissance no longer aligned with the battlefield's demands. And as the German army looked toward new vehicles and new methods, the question shifted from how the 222 could be improved to what would replace it entirely. Because the war ahead required a different kind of scout, built for a world the old doctrine had never imagined. Among German reconnaissance crews, the Sd.Kfz 222 eventually earned a nickname whispered with a mix of irony and resignation, Der Glücklich, the lucky one. It was not a tribute to its performance, nor a celebration of its agility. It was an admission. Survival inside the 222 depended not on its armor, nor its design, nor even the skill of its crew, but on the unpredictable grace of luck. Veterans understood this deeply. They knew that the difference between returning to base and vanishing into the smoke of a field was often measured in the angle of a ricochet or the second in which an enemy rifleman hesitated. As the war progressed, this hard-won knowledge began finding its way into official doctrine. Training manuals were quietly adjusted, not with bold proclamations but with subtle, telling changes in tone. Recruits were no longer told to rely on the vehicle's speed alone. Instead, they were warned: avoid direct fire, avoid open terrain, avoid lingering even for a moment. Reconnaissance was redefined not as a swift approach, but as a delicate negotiation with danger. The machine's thin armor imposed its own rules, rules that every crewman learned before he ever climbed into the turret. But the real instruction came not from manuals but from the men who had survived repeated patrols. Veterans took new arrivals aside and taught them the unwritten principles that kept seasoned crews alive. Do not silhouette the vehicle against the horizon. Do not crest a ridge without dismounting first. Never trust that an empty road is truly empty. And above all, never assume the armor can save you. These lessons carried the calm authority of experience, delivered without dramatization because the truth required none. In their quiet delivery, recruits sensed the gravity of what awaited them. Some officers, recognizing the limits of the 222, began requesting to retain captured Allied scout cars instead. British Daimler armored cars or American M8s, with thicker armor and enclosed turrets, offered a sense of security the 222 could not match. Though the requests were rarely granted, the impulse revealed a shifting attitude. Speed had once been the defining virtue of German reconnaissance. Now, survivability held equal, if not greater, importance. In this subtle shift, the 222's era was beginning to close. The vehicle became an artifact of an earlier phase of the war, respected for what it had once achieved, yet unmistakably outdated. Crews acknowledged its history with a kind of solemn admiration. They respected its agility, its reliability, its ability to maneuver across broken terrain where heavier vehicles faltered. But they also understood that its era had passed. The 222 had been designed for a conflict Germany no longer fought, a conflict defined by fluid lines and unprepared opponents. The war that now surrounded them was different, heavier, faster, more lethal. Reflection became a companion to many crewmen who spent long hours in the cramped interior of the vehicle. They grew philosophical about the machine's vulnerabilities, not out of cynicism, but out of a clear-eyed recognition of their circumstances. Each patrol carried the possibility of finality, and they accepted this with a quiet professionalism that belied the danger. Letters home often spoke of the 222 with affection tinged by fatalism, a vehicle admired for its grace and feared for its fragility. And so the myth of German invincibility, once a powerful element of wartime propaganda, encountered the immutable reality of steel only 8 millimeters thick. The reconnaissance car that had symbolized the daring thrusts of early blitzkrieg was now a reminder of how swiftly the war had evolved. and how brutally it exposed the limits of pre-war assumptions. For the men who rode inside it, the truth required no further explanation. They lived that truth each time the engine turned over, and the world outside narrowed to the vulnerable shell that carried them forward, toward whatever waited in the next stretch of contested ground. When Allied mechanics completed their examination of the captured Sd.Kfz 222, the results were recorded with clinical clarity. The vehicle, they wrote, was fast and agile, capable of accelerating over broken ground with an elegance unfamiliar to many Allied designs. Its steering was responsive, its power-to-weight ratio admirable. Yet these strengths were overshadowed by a flaw so fundamental that it redefined the machine entirely. The armor, sloped, riveted, and confidently presented, was dangerously thin. Against modern firepower, the 222 was not a shield but a suggestion of one. The report did not dramatize this point, it simply stated it, and that precision carried its own weight. As the findings circulated through infantry briefings, they began influencing the expectations of ordinary riflemen. Soldiers who had once treated the 222 with wary distance now learned that its armor could be penetrated by weapons they carried daily. No longer was it a threat requiring heavy support to neutralize. It was a vehicle vulnerable to disciplined marksmanship and coordinated fire. The psychological shift was immediate. Knowledge, once confined to technical workshops, filtered into the field where it changed not only tactics but confidence. Riflemen began firing at ranges they once avoided. Where earlier units might have hesitated, waiting for anti-tank support or for the scout car to withdraw, they now responded with purposeful aggression. Bursts of automatic fire were aimed at the turret ring, the engine grille, the side plates known to be only a few millimeters thick. The Sd.Kfz 222, which had once relied on the ambiguity of its appearance, the suggestion of protection, the silhouette reminiscent of heavier armor, lost that ambiguity entirely. Its threat diminished not because it changed, but because the enemy understood precisely what it was. In this shift, the 222 forfeited an intangible advantage it had carried since the first days of war: psychological dominance. Machines often possess an aura independent of their actual capabilities. Rumors and appearances shape the reactions of those who face them. But once stripped of mystery, the vehicle no longer inspired caution. Its approach triggered not fear, but calculation. Infantrymen measured angles, assessed cover, and identified weak points, acting with the calm assurance that they were facing a target, not a juggernaut. Gradually, the 222's battlefield identity transformed. What had once been considered a fearsome scout, an extension of German momentum, became, in the eyes of Allied soldiers, a fragile relic of earlier campaigns. Its light plating, previously accepted as a trade-off for speed, now appeared as an artifact of flawed assumptions made before the war's pace accelerated and its lethality intensified. The vehicle belonged to a moment in military thought that no longer existed. A moment when mobility was still imagined to outweigh protection. Within intelligence circles, the 8mm of the 222 became a recurring symbol. It stood for the limitations of pre-war doctrine, the hazards of underestimating enemy adaptation, and the risks of designing a machine around an environment that would inevitably change. The thin plating, measured and catalogued in technical reports, carried a moral weight beyond its physical reality. It reminded commanders that assumptions, even well-reasoned ones, could become vulnerabilities when the battlefield shifted. And so, with each briefing, each diagram, each annotated photograph of the captured car, the Allied understanding of the Sd.Kfz 222 sharpened. Knowledge replaced uncertainty. Awareness redefined threat. Soldiers no longer responded to the vehicle for what it appeared to be, but for what they knew it was. In that transformation, the battlefield itself subtly changed. Because once an army learns how to read a machine, its weaknesses, its habits, its limits, the machine can no longer hide behind reputation. And for the Sd.Kfz 222, that moment marked the beginning of its final chapter, where understanding proved more decisive than firepower. In the years after the war, when analysts finally had the distance to reflect without the urgency of combat, the Sd.Kfz 222 drew renewed attention. They did not study it merely to catalog its shortcomings or to dissect its losses. Instead, they approached it as a symbol, an object lesson in the ambitions and assumptions that shaped the early years of mechanized warfare. The 222 stood not only as a machine, but as a distillation of a doctrine that once seemed unstoppable and later proved tragically insufficient. Its design captured the essence of early blitzkrieg thinking: daring, mobile, confident, and certain that speed could offset vulnerability. The vehicle embodied the belief that wars could be won through momentum and initiative, that the enemy would remain disorganized long enough for reconnaissance units to operate almost unhindered. It was a doctrine forged in the constrained landscapes of interwar Europe, where theoretical scenarios seldom accounted for the intensity and scale of the conflict that would soon unfold. In this sense, the 222 was not flawed. It was accurate to the expectations of its time. It was the world that changed around it. Post-war engineers evaluated the 222 with the clarity of hindsight. They noted that for 1939 it was a brilliant creation: fast, efficient, and perfectly suited to a form of warfare that emphasized penetration and tempo over attrition. But by 1942, as firepower increased and the battlefield thickened with new threats, the same features that had defined its genius now revealed its fragility. And by 1944, when automatic weapons saturated every approach and ambush tactics matured across all fronts, operating a 222 in contested terrain bordered on the suicidal. Its evolution was not technological but contextual. The machine remained the same, while the environment around it accelerated beyond its limits. Historians traced its influence through the decades that followed. Many later armored cars adopted its core strengths: high mobility, wide visibility, rapid acceleration, but with a crucial adjustment: improved protection. Designers had learned from the 222's vulnerabilities, ensuring that modern reconnaissance platforms carried armor capable of withstanding the most common battlefield threats. The legacy of the Sd.Kfz 222 was therefore not erased by its shortcomings. It was absorbed into the development of future vehicles that balanced speed with survivability more deliberately. Veterans who rode in the 222 remembered it with a blend of respect and unease. They admired its agility, the way it responded instantly on rough ground, the sense of control it offered at high speed. Yet those same veterans often spoke of its survivability with a quiet sobriety. They recalled the sound of small arms fire striking the hull, the knowledge that even a rifle round could become fatal, the discipline required to navigate a battlefield in a machine that demanded both confidence and caution. Their memories reflected the duality of the vehicle: capable and compromising, admirable and unforgiving. Today, the Sd.Kfz 222 occupies museum halls and historical collections, preserved not as a failure, but as a reminder of a doctrine overtaken by the war it helped initiate. Visitors see its angular plates, its open turret, its compact frame, and they confront an artifact from a moment when armies believed mobility could dictate the pace of conflict indefinitely. Its thin armor, measured at just 8 in many places, has become a metaphor for strategic overconfidence, a tangible illustration of how bold ideas must adapt when reality refuses to remain predictable. And in that preserved steel, the legacy of the 222 endures, a testament to innovation shaped by its time and a warning about the limits of speed. In a world where the battlefield evolves faster than the machines sent to master it. In the quiet of the clearing, as evening light thinned across the treetops, the captured Sd.Kfz 222 sat motionless. Its angular hull, designed for speed and momentum, seemed strangely out of place in stillness. The dust that had clung to it during its final moments of use now settled more deeply into every seam, softening the sharp lines of a vehicle built for motion. For the first time in its service life, the machine had no destination, no direction, no mission. It simply existed, an artifact from a war that had moved beyond the assumptions that once shaped it. The mechanics gathered their tools and notebooks, preparing to finalize the report they had begun earlier that day. What they wrote would influence not only intelligence briefings, but the instincts of soldiers who might soon face similar machines in the field. They understood the weight of that responsibility. This was not just a list of measurements or observations. It was a portrait of a doctrine rendered in metal, a doctrine that had been tested, revealed, and in some ways undone by the rifle shots that still echoed faintly in their memory. As they reviewed their notes, an unspoken reflection hung between them. How many decisions in war were built on assumptions that seemed reasonable until the moment they met resistance? Some assumptions endured. Others fractured under pressure, their flaws exposed by the simplest encounters. The Sd.Kfz 222 had been designed around one such assumption, that speed could stand where armor could not. It was a belief that had shaped tactics, training, and the machine now resting before them. But the battlefield had changed, and the assumption no longer held. The evidence stood etched into the hull itself. The bullet marks scattered across the steel told a stark, uncomplicated truth. Each indentation represented an idea tested and found wanting. The rounds had struck with modest force, yet still they had bent the metal inward, revealing the thinness of the armor and the vulnerability it concealed. The lesson was unmistakable. Steel cannot protect an idea that no longer fits the battlefield. A concept may be elegant in theory, efficient in design, even successful for a time. But once the environment shifts, its weaknesses emerge with unforgiving clarity. One mechanic, brushing a gloved hand across the shallow crater left by a rifle round, said quietly what the others were already thinking. The Sd.Kfz 222's armor was thin because the doctrine behind it was thin, built on a war Germany expected, not the one it received. The vehicle had been honest to its philosophy, but the philosophy had failed to anticipate the pace of enemy adaptation. In that sense, the damage on the hull was more than physical. It was symbolic, a visible record of the moment when ideals encountered reality. As the men stepped back from the car, preparing to leave the clearing, their impression of the machine had shifted. It no longer felt like a trophy wrested from the enemy, a prize of victory or a specimen to be studied with detached curiosity. It felt closer to a lesson, one written not in textbooks, but in the steel of a vehicle whose time had passed. A reminder that even the most confident doctrines must answer to the battlefield, and that no amount of engineering can shield a flawed assumption from the consequences of war. They walked away in silence, each man carrying the conclusions that the day had carved into their understanding. The Sd.Kfz 222 remained behind them, darkening as the light faded, its stillness now complete. They had trusted its armor once, or at least the idea of its armor. They never trusted it again.